Hello, I'm Rupert Sheldrake. I'm here with David Bentley Hart. Hello, David.
Hello.
Um, I'm really pleased that you agreed to talk together on Zoom. I'm a great fan of your work and your books, and I've recently been reading your recent book, Roland in Moonlight,
Well,
which,
there's the face that launched 1,000 ships.
which is a totally astonishing book. Um,
Thank you.
I've read lots of animal books, and I've written some myself. I wrote a book, as you know, called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home.
I love that book, by the way.
Oh, good. I'm glad you do, because it was a lot of fun to write, because collecting stories, doing research on these unexplained powers of animals was, a thrilling thing to do, really. And it's uncharted territory. There's very, very few scientific investigations of this area, and most scientists just dismiss all these wonderful stories by saying it's just anecdotes. But, science is meant to be empirical, and I take the view that the plural of anecdote is data. And if lots of people tell the same kinds of stories, then it suggests something might well be happening. And then, of course, as you know, I investigated some of these things experimentally. And then the other book where I've written about them, as you know, is Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work, where I have a chapter called Learning from Animals.
Yeah.
But nothing I'd done in either of these books or in any of my investigations had prepared me for Roland in Moonlight, which takes animal relationships to a totally new level. I mean, where Roland, we're all familiar with talking animals from children's books. I mean, I particularly liked Rupert Bear, who's a character in English children's books.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Rupert Bear. Yes.
Yes, well, for obvious reasons, I identified quite strongly with Rupert Bear as a child. And then there are all these other talking animals, and as in Dr. Dolittle and in Winnie the Pooh and so on. And I think it's
And the
interesting.
wind in the willows. Never forget the wind in the willows. That's sacred script for me.
Exactly, the wind and the willows. And we encourage children to believe in talking animals, to live in an animistic world. And even the most materialistic and atheistic of people still seem to think it's absolutely fine for children to live in an animistic world of talking animals. But we're supposed to grow out of it by the time we're about 10. But what's remarkable about your encounters with Roland is that you haven't grown out of it. You've grown into it and taken it a great deal further than anyone else I've ever encountered. And I wonder, did you, I mean, it's very hard to imagine how you could have hit on the idea of such a book. And if you don't mind saying a few words, I'd love to know.
Well, actually, the book itself is almost accidental. It started as just one column that I wrote fancifully years ago for a journal that I no longer write for, and I won't talk about, but that was I wrote six of these columns, and the editor of the press that published the book, John Reese, suggested it. But I think what he was expecting was something uh, less involved and ambitious and personal in many ways. Though he was very happy with when he got the manuscript. But it's a book that does, if obliquely, reflect the way I see reality. I have learned a great deal from my relations with animals over the years, and early on in my studies, when I wasn't quite sure what area of religious studies I might focus on, when I was studying Cheyenne and Plains American Native culture, and Eastern Woodland as well. I was always fascinated with the cultures that imagined having spiritual guides in the form of animals who spoke to them in dream states or in visionary states. So And also, I don't think I ever really grew up. I never really grew out of The Wind in the Willows. I still seem to read it every other year or so. So, um, in a sense, it's a very natural book for me to write, and it's sort of a portmanteau that I could pour everything into.
Well, I mean, as a kind of spirit guide, which is a part of a shamanic tradition in many parts of the world, um, you know, Roland clearly fits into that role, but it's what makes it so unusual is that in part, in earlier parts of the book, he's introducing you to the sensory delights of the woodland, seeing fairies and unseen beings, etc. But as the book wears on, he turns into a kind of Confucian scholar, haiku writing Japanese scholar, a kind of monk, a monk-like figure with his study, his manuscripts, his contributions to learned journals, to historical archives, his editing of your great uncle's papers, etc. Um, and I've never seen an animal placed in this role of a kind of towering, inspirational, inclusive intellect. And what's so engaging about it is that his ideas, which are speculative, would be thrilling in any philosophical or theological book, somehow come across without all the apparatus of scholarly footnotes and defensiveness, etc. It's kind of visionary flow. Um, and I suppose that the spirit animal thing enabled you to channel that or get into that somehow in a way that you couldn't have done if you'd just been writing expository philosophy. Anyway,
Well,
it comes across like that.
that's very true. And I also think that we can make interesting ideas terrifically boring quite often. You know, as good Humboldtian scholars, we know that an idea hasn't really been proposed until it's been killed with sufficient scholarly apparatus. Um, but yeah, it allows for one to be speculatively adventurous without readers necessarily throwing their guards up either. Um, you know, simply allowing because the fabulous premise in itself allows the ideas to gain entry when quite often the doors of the mind might be shut against them. So.
I know it works unbelievably well. I mean, I'm sure it'll spawn a host of imitators, but
I wouldn't recommend it. I would.
no.
Unless you're
Well,
ready to write 14 pages of heroic couplets or throwing, you know.
well, the heroic couplet bit, I must admit, I found slightly less appealing and slightly harder to read. But I,
Well, these are matters of taste. Some praise that part as their favorite part of the book to me, and some say that they don't really they don't really like great Uncle Aloysius nearly as much as Roland, and then others find him very appealing. I don't know. To me, the three voices in the book are really, of course, different facets of myself. So I can't really, in some sense, I can't really judge among them.
but I thought, I mean, great Uncle Aloysius is a very attractive figure in the sense that he's exploring an animistic world in a period of American history, early 20th century, when materialism, secularism were completely rife, and a kind of mechanistic view of animals and nature. And he was clearly rebelling against that, and wholeheartedly rebelling against that, and creating this animistic world in which animals and all nature is alive. And of course, the Roland as a talking and philosophizing dog, a being of great compassion, a kind of exemplary character. Um,
Or perhaps even a bodhisattva, it's suggested at one point.
yes, something like that, who acts as a kind of mirror for the follies of humanity. I mean, Aloysius, in a sense, prepares the way for Roland and this more animistic view, the context in which Roland can emerge. It would be hard for him to emerge straight from sort
A
of.
vox clamantis in deserto, I think.
Yes, and it would be very hard for Roland to emerge from sort of biology 101 course in a university, from a completely different world of animals with no spiritual dimension. And I mean, of course, most people who keep pets are aware that their animals have emotional dimensions that they lack themselves and psychic abilities that they lack themselves, which is why so many people are happy to talk about their dog knowing when they're coming home or picking up their intentions or
And it's curious. I mean, I love, as I said, I love your book on dogs who know when the masters are coming home, in part because it's an ordinary experience shared by such a vast number of people who've lived with animals. In a sense, even before the experimental regimen you undertook, it's an indubitable fact of experience, and yet somehow it passes by, scarcely noticed even by those who are aware of it, what its significance might be. And yet we know it to be true. I mean, even those of us who just sort of tacitly presume a kind of mechanistic model of the mind and assume that we're all enclosed within our skulls and communicate only through representations distilled through words, will, when we just consult our experience of animals we've lived with, not even the sort of extraordinary experiences we sometimes have of others, synchronicities or intuitions or forebodings, or just the everyday experience we have of animals, we know that they know things that they cannot possibly know except through some kind of communion that eludes the mechanistic model or the model of perfectly self-enclosed mind. And I just thought, as I say, I thought it was a wonderful book because, well, of course, anyway, I can be drawn to anything about dogs.
well, it is. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that for many people, these events, the dog knowing or the cat knowing when they're coming home, telling people at home if there's somebody there, when the person's on the way, is something that's happening in literally millions of American and European households every day. Probably as we speak, there are hundreds of thousands of dogs doing this around the world. And, and yet, it's classified in science, if it's noticed at all, as a paranormal ability. But it's not paranormal in any normal sense of the word normality, because it's happening to millions and millions of dogs and in millions and millions of families on a day-by-day basis. It's normal, but it's paranormal in the context of mechanistic science, and that's why it's a kind of taboo subject. So I think of it as one of what I call the mysteries of everyday life, that there are so many things about everyday life that tell us our minds are more extensive than our brains and that we're much more connected than we usually think, that our intentions can have an effect at a distance, as they do on dogs knowing when we're coming home. That I think that dogs can, and other animals can, illuminate these aspects of our own nature.
Well, I agree.
One of the things that I've puzzled over for many, many years is the degree to which animals have what we might call spiritual experiences, that it's normally assumed, and most religions seem very human-centric, as indeed does secular humanism, a non-religious form of religion. They're very human-centric, and they tend to assume that only humans can have spiritual experiences. Whereas it seems to me that it's very likely that lots of animals do, because the main barrier to the sense of divine presence, or as we learn through meditation teachers, is, at least they would call it, the sense of presence, or presence to the one mind, is the chattering mind, the discursive mind, the default mode network of the brain, which is all about ruminations, thoughts, worries, anxieties, etc., which clutter up our minds. And presumably the average dog or cat may have a little anxiety about when its owner's coming home or when it's going to get its next meal, but much less than us. And many animals, being non-human animals, are almost automatically in the present, vastly more than we are. I think that's one reason that keeping pets and riding horses and being with animals is so attractive to so many people, because it brings us into the present in a way that we would not normally be.
Yeah, no, I curiously enough, I mean, well, of course, I take my lead from Christopher Smart on this. You know, his cat Jeffrey purrs when God tells him he's a good cat. And I assume that actually expresses a real dimension of animal experience, a sense of, you know, the immediate presence of a kind of benign approval of the divine. But also, I think it's curious. I've never thought that we keep pets in order to keep ourselves grounded in animal nature or practical or, you know, corporeal ordinariness, as I've heard it said by one or two persons who are talking about the psychology, or what the adaptive evolutionary psychology of keeping pets might be, and what, you know, how they among other things, focus us on certain material exigencies. I've always thought it was quite the opposite, that we keep animals because they open up experience that isn't filtered through purely discursive, purely ratiocinative and calculative intellect that has that relates to nature or the world about us or to others in an instrumental fashion, or to exploit the world simply for our own ends. And in that sense, they open us up to avenues, spiritual avenues, of a reconciliation with the natural world around us and with one another. You know, the spontaneous affection of a dog isn't, I think, just an an adaptation produced purely by evolutionary imperatives and attritions and phylogenetic acquisitions and all that, that in a sense, the dog is giving us a much more immediate experience of sanity and a spiritual, a genuinely spiritual condition of life that if not, we can't be dogs, but if we were to imitate some of that spontaneity, or aspire to do so, we might find ourselves being more like dogs, and at the same time being more like angels as a result.
Yes. I wonder if different species of animals have different degrees of access to the spiritual realm. I sometimes think that small birds, when you see them, they're constantly looking around because they're so afraid of predators that they probably don't have so much time to relax as larger animals, like horses or larger birds.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if spiritual experience is always a matter of relaxation. It may be for us larger mammals necessary to still the intellect in that way. Sometimes, if you have a differently constructed mind, a certain kind of special alertness. After all, you know, I was thinking the Upanishadic image of the Atman is always as a bird, right? Or not always, but frequently the two birds sitting upon the bough. The one, the apotent, eats of the fruit of the bough and is bound to the bough, whereas the other does not eat and is in bliss, you know. So I don't like to presume on the minds of birds. I'm not sure it may be the case that, say, an octopus has a richer spiritual life than a trout. But, it may be that the trout has a spiritual life in a modality that the octopus would envy if he could have a taste of it. So,
Well, I suppose there's one aspect of spiritual experience. As you know, in my book, Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work, I start with a discussion of sports, the spiritual side of sports. And I think for many people in the modern world, although it's not recognized as a spiritual experience exactly, or at least not usually, the sense of being present in motion, in skilled motion through skiing downhill at 60 miles an hour, or being in the middle of a ping pong game of complete concentration on the game, or climbing a mountain and the complete concentration of finding footholds and finger holes, or fast sports where just one false move and you're dead. I mean, the sense of presence that comes in those sports is not a sense of relaxation, it's a sense of intense concentration and presence in motion, in skilled exercise the exercise of skill in motion and activity. And presumably that's something which many animals may also feel. I mean, gibbons leaping from branch to branch of a tree, or birds soaring on thermals, or cormorants plunging in a dive as they fish. All of these things or a dog chasing a stick and running in a kind of joyful way, all of these could be thrillingly spiritual experiences for animals in which we participate and have a taste of sports.
I think that's true. I think, of course, also sport well played is often a kind of state of release. I mean, the conscious mind has to surrender to a kind of bodily habitus that plays the game without calculative. For me, the supreme example is baseball. All right, because baseball includes any number of skills that seem to be impossible. Hitting a major league hard slider with a cylindrical bat and driving it, seems like something. And if you think about it, it's the one game I played with any particular skill in my youth. When you think about it, you can't do it. I mean, you simply can't. You can know what you're doing and prepare yourself for it, but in the moment, it's either done or not done. But you're not forcing it to happen. One of the greatest players of the game in Japanese history, the great Sadaharu O, wrote a wonderful book about baseball. That's also something of a Zen treatise and something of a Shinto treatise that goes into this in great depth. But I think that's true. That in those experiences we might rediscover dimensions of our animal experience that are also exalting. That they're elevating. That it's not a descent into the sordid and the bestial, but actually into a condition of spiritual freedom and release. I think I read that I read that book as well. That's your most recent. And I thought all of that was quite correct, quite apt.
Yes, I was. Of course, the way in which it relates to the spiritual realm is something that interests me a lot, and this dynamical aspect. It's all about movement. There's some spiritual practices like meditation about sitting still or being still, but these sports type ones and animal activities a lot of them are about movement and being in the flow, and that aspect of the spiritual world is represented, at least in the Western tradition, by the concept of the spirit, which is all about flow, movement, change, and indeed represented by a flying bird in the form of a pigeon or dove. Do you think it's a valid connection to say that that would be relating to the aspect of the Holy Trinity or spiritual reality that we call the Holy Spirit?
Oh, well, that's interesting. Of course, you're entering into a fairly fraught, both doctrinal and speculative area there. Excuse me, I have to turn off my phone. Apparently, it's ringing. And but I think it's true that if you look at the various models trying to understand the Trinity from, say, the greatest expositors in the high patristic tradition, especially like Augustine or the Cappadocian Fathers, there is an understanding of the Spirit as peculiarly God as life and act. You know, if you take the understanding of the Trinity that you find adumbrated in a couple places in Gregory of Nyssa and brought to a brilliantly, remember, I'm an Eastern Christian when I say this, the single greatest systematic treatise in Christian theological history, Augustine's De Trinitate. The Spirit is the most mysterious, precisely, aspect of the Trinitarian mystery, precisely because it is the most immediate, and in a sense, the place where the divine trespasses on its own transcendence, or where the division between the divine and the created is overcome in a single sort of fused experience, in the sense that many theologians, for instance, would reflect on the notion that for Christian tradition, taking the idea from Genesis that God, neshama or pnoi, or breath, pneuma, is breathed into Adam and thereby makes a living soul, and that the ultimate union, the deifying union with God, is accomplished by the human spirit in direct union with the Holy Spirit, transforming us evermore into the image of God in Christ, who is the true image of the Father, and all that. The Spirit is in a sense the God as purely accomplished act. The Trinitarian taxis as life, not just as an abstract relation between the paternal depth and the filial expression of that depth in a perfect icon, but and this has been maybe all the richest strains of Christian metaphysical thought from the patristic period through the medieval, through the German idealists, which whether it distorts or not, nonetheless, Hegel understood a great deal about the metaphysics of Trinitarian thought. Bring us back to this: the Spirit is the name of the reality of God that also somehow is the most primordial reality of creatures and creation, and that is the ungovernable principle of life and act. So that was a long way of getting around to saying yes. I think so. The problem, it's such a, that really is the richest and in sometimes the most contentious aspect of Christian Trinitarian metaphysics,
Well, wonderful. That insofar as it's the spirit of life, then what we're talking about is life as it in its various expressions.
Yeah.
I don't know, this is somewhat slightly off our main talk about animals, but my other great passion is for plants. I started out as a botanist.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you have thought very much about the spirit in plants, or in how these various principles apply in the plant realm.
Yeah, well, I mean, I assume, being the antithesis of a mechanist in my thinking, that all that lives is always already spiritual. And since I think everything lives, I mean, we can go down to the mineral level in some sense. I mean, or at least crystallography, but down to the mineral level too. I think we can. But yeah, I mean, I think, and I think the more we know about the peculiar sensitivity, and even, I don't want to use the term cognition necessarily, but the communicative skills, the rhizomatic, the mycorrhizomatic systems of communications used by some plants, the sensitivity of plants, not just to their material environment, but actually to the emotional environment at times, apparently in which they grow, gives evidence that spirit, as a principle, penetrates to the very ground. In fact, it is the ground. And so, yeah, I mean, I think about it, and in fact, actually try to be sensitive to it, make an effort to be kind to the plants in the garden, but yeah, no, I mean, I don't think there is a partition at which spirit is absent from life, from living nature. There are traditions. I mean, there are Christian traditions that can be terrifically austere in this regard. The sort of the 16th century school of Thomism has kind of has had trouble with any number of to my mind, spurious divisions between the supernatural and the natural, the gracious and the grace in nature. I don't even actually think that these are real theological dichotomies and terms in the New Testament. I think that's all a misreading, but also a kind of among certain current expositors, almost a hostility to the notion that you can speak of spirit in regard to anything other than, in us at least, intellect. Intellectus, in the sense of the highest function of the mind, is being illuminated by spirit, and spirit as the creator spirit who gives life, but whose presence in nature is not constitutive of a kind of spiritual dimension in the nature. So they'll deny that animals are spiritual beings, and most certainly that plants have spiritual life or spiritual existence. And to me, that's a fairly dreadful vision of reality. It's also, I think, a good example of what happened even to a tradition that came out of a high medieval background when translated through the causal terms of early modernity, which made it all the more, as I say, austere in its ontology of nature. But on the whole, I think that the biblical language and the language of the best and the greatest of the fathers and theologians, and especially some of the ones who are daringly aberrant, like John Scotus Erigena and others, recognizes that spirit is the pervasive, not just pervasive of, but the pervading ground of all that lives and all that exists. And although I better stop there for fear of spilling over into a long disquisition.
Well, I know, totally fascinating. I think that in a sense, it's still there in its totally secularized form, because the founding of modern science in the 17th century, and especially Descartes' vision and his split, where the spirit is taken out of nature altogether and evacuated into a realm of God, angels, and human minds, and then the rest of nature is inanimate, unconscious, mechanistic, is what we're living with today. I mean, that's what's being taught to every child in every science course, at least implicitly, in every school in the world, more or less. And so we're educating people into that worldview in the name of science. But science is sort
It's
of,
curious, though, isn't it? How I'm sorry if I could just say, it's curious, isn't it? How what began really as just not in Descartes, yes, but also in Galileo and in Francis Bacon in a different way, and in others, the bracketing out of the language of mind and of spirit from nature in order to create an inductive method that views the world as a machine that can be taken apart and put back together. Um, at least when that method was devised, which, whatever its use or not, recognized that you couldn't reduce the spiritual to the mechanical. That metastasized into a metaphysics. I mean, a tacit religious view almost of the world. And the metaphysics, every metaphysics deplores a dualism. At the end, it has to reduce every dualism to the single ground, the principle of unity that allows the whole thing to function as a system. And the choice was to view matter as mechanistic matter as the ground. And so all those things that had been expelled from nature in order to produce the method now had to be explained in terms of a method that was in principle nothing but their expulsion. And so the impotence of this method to explain even human intentionality, or even to have a plausible account of it in terms of the metaphysics of nature it presumes, is almost comical at times, or would be if it weren't so tragic. And you're right. This is the image of reality we're given, and yet it's an image of reality that nowhere could possibly accord with experience.
yes, and it's the context against which the modern revival of panpsychism and so on is taking place, because we have to start, at least in science, with the generally implicit assumption that nature is mechanical, materialist, and unconscious. But I think one of the things that interests me about the world of the spirit in nature is, in the early 19th century, the discovery of energy as a unifying principle for all nature, so that all nature is now seen as a manifestation of the flow of energy. You know, energy can take many forms. Energy is promiscuous in the sense it can take thousands and millions of different forms. Every plant or animal or atom or crystal or beam of light is a manifestation of energy. But the energy in itself has no content or form. Just like the energy in an electric plug, you can plug in a computer or a hairdryer or an electric heater or a hair curling device or whatever, or something to power a pump in an aquarium. And the same energy can do all those things. And the same energy in the sunlight that's falling on my garden right now is empowering plants of many different species to grow. And if it had fallen, that photon had fallen on a different leaf, it would be empowering a different species. So there's this vision within science of energy as a unifying principle that underlies all the manifestations of nature, empowers them, gives them energy, life, activity. And yet it's a mysterious, if the more you think about it, the more elusive it seems. And yet, if one sort of then looks at that and says, well, this energy is a manifestation of spirit, then modern science has given us an extraordinary unified view of the manifestations of spirit in all the phenomena of nature.
Well, I mean, obviously that appeals to me because far from wanting to reduce the spiritual to the material, I'm convinced that the proper way to proceed is to assume that the ultimate disclosure of reality involves a certain reduction of the material to the spiritual. And so the very structure of nature and energy as a unifying principle would be an emergent reality of spirit as the sole ground of existence. And I think it's not simply a sort of fantastic cast of mind that makes one think this way. There are very good logical reasons for arguing that starting from a mechanistic view of matter, we could never have gotten simply by way of some process of emergence to many of the phenomena we want to explain, again, with consciousness just as an intentionality, just or first person consciousness, or unity of the field of apprehension, a number of things. Whereas logically speaking, it makes, and this is grasped in modern theories of panpsychism to a degree. I think when modern panpsychism tries to remain also a physicalism, it misunderstands what it's doing, because then it's trying to make consciousness into a discrete property of the sort of like weight, like mass, or not weight, but like mass or velocity. And that's not what consciousness is. That's not what consciousness is. Always, it's always an act. It has a phenomenological contour that can be described and constructed. It always starts from a sort of unified field of apprehension and has an intentional structure. But it is logically plausible to think of that structure, that we call consciousness, as the inherent rationality of whatever exists, that then is expressed in various modalities, including physical nature. I think, a proper way, say, of reading the old Aristotelian language of causality would be to see it as saying nature is inherently mind-like in its structure. Now, and then you can rescue the drier parts of Aristotelianism through a good, healthy Neoplatonism that, but that's a different matter. And so, I mean, I think it's actually, prima facie, the logically more coherent presupposition. Every presupposition has to be subjected to evidence, reason, whatever. But when you try to account for the phenomena of any number of phenomena, including consciousness, but also of the extraordinary complex structure of physical organisms and the obvious and manifest reality of downward causation and so on and so forth, this is the more logical premise to begin from.
Well, I agree. I think myself that science, the development of science since the 19th century has revealed really is that the two most fundamental principles in nature are energy and fields. And fields are what give structure, order, pattern, and relationship to nature, starting with the universal gravitational field, which, talk of top-down structures, here's this field which includes and shapes the entire universe and provides the context of everything. And as Einstein said, the gravitational field is not in space and time, it is space-time. So we have like the soul of the universe, and the gravitational field. Then we have all these other fields of nature, the electromagnetic fields, the quantum fields. And as you know, I think that within living organisms there are formative fields, of morphogenetic fields and behavioral fields, and organizing fields of social groups. And these fields have a great deal in common with what Aristotle called souls, it seems to me.
As the forming life principle. I mean, that's really maybe the best way, a cumbersome way of translating psyche, but that's what Aristotle's talking about, right?
So we have in science itself, as part of the standard explanatory basis of science, fields which are often attractive. They work towards attractors. The gravitational field is literally attractive. It's pulling, literally pulling you and me down towards the ground right now, otherwise we'd be floating. It's pulling the moon to keeping it in orbit. And other fields, electrical and magnetic fields, have attractive and repulsive aspects. They're not just static. They're to do with, you could say, intention that's built into fields. There's a kind of intentionality built into fields. And one can see this through the whole of nature, because fields pervade nature and all organized things. Quantum theory explains even the most fundamental particles of matter in terms of energy bound within fields. And so when one sees the organizing principles of animals and plants as field-like, and the energy flowing through them as spirit-like, as we've just been talking, I think what this mechanistic science has actually done is prepared the ground for flipping the whole thing around and seeing it from an opposite point of view.
I think that's very true.
And so it then creates the context for the move that I think you're doing, and actually in your book Roland does supremely well, where he has this divine consciousness in all things. I mean, I can't lay my hand on the exact passage now. I hardly need to quote it to you since you wrote it, but
I transcribed it. It was dictated, needless to say.
Exactly, you transcribed it well, and he conveniently put it, for although he knows many languages, he conveniently gave you most of this in English, although there are bits of untranslated Hindi, and clearly
well, Sanskrit, technically, yes. Right.
Sanskrit, yes. It was the Navigandra. Yes, the script.
I was reproached by that for that, so by someone might have gone too far, setting puzzles in the texts here and there. But anyway.
Well, I think Roland's sense of humour and sophistication is puts us all to shame, really, and. I love the way that as he goes on in the book, you stumble to catch up. You say, but doesn't that mean he carries on? So you act as a kind of bridge between the sophisticated world of Roland and his consciousness, which is...
I'm the plodding, leaden, ordinary minded scholar in the book. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. You're the sort of the Boswell to the life of Roland, as it were. So he has more and more passages where it uninterruptedly flows. But one of the things that I think Roland is doing is actually inverting this scientific picture that we've all grown up with, and seeing it from the spiritual point of view, and it actually fits extraordinarily well. I mean, in 19th century physics, you wouldn't have been able to do this because they had hard billiard ball-like bits of matter which were very unpromising. But we've now got vibratory patterns of activity within fields and processes as the very basis of all physical and biological reality, and indeed mental reality. So I think it's all so much easier now to see from the point of view that Roland is leading us towards.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is curious when you encounter, say, a philosopher like Daniel Dennett, for instance, whose metaphysics. I mean, he's got a very sophisticated grasp of various fields of the sciences, and yet metaphysically, he is still in the 17th century. Very much, and what's fascinating to me in the 20th and 21st century, the degree to which it may prove that the usefulness of the mechanistic paradigm as a methodological proposition was to see all the ways in which it subverted itself, or the ways in which when placed under stress, it gave way at crucial junctures. And it's odd. I mean, as I say, Dennett, when it comes to the question of mind, some of the lengths he'll go to try to explain away consciousness, which at least is testament to his sophistication in understanding that consciousness, if it really is what it seems to be from experience, cannot possibly accord with the image of reality he's promoting. Nonetheless, he clings to a metaphysics that's really pretty much purely mechanistic. I mean, as a metaphysics, even though the findings of the sciences of physics, but also molecular biology, call this model into question again and again and again, and at times make it entirely untenable.
Yes. Well, I think that's the problem with a lot of the the new atheists, actually. I mean, Dennett admits that organisms are best understood in terms of intentionality. Um,
How else can you investigate them? You treat them as intentional systems and then see if your hypothesis works.
yes, so he actually admits teleology and purpose, but then he says it's not really teleology, it's
Right.
as if they're purposive. So we can
It's
think
always a
about them as
methodological fiction. Yeah.
yeah, we
But
can say
how would we know that?
yes, well, as if. So he sort of gets out of it all. Um, I was reminded of this general approach recently in watching a talk by Sam Harris about an intense mushroom experience he had recently. And he was saying how during this experience he could easily understand how mystics would think that their consciousness was one with a greater consciousness, that they were part of a vastly greater conscious system, because that's exactly how he experienced it. But after he'd come round from his mushroom trip, he said, but of course, now I'm back in my normal frame of mind. I know that these are nothing but images produced within the brain. So he privileges a theory, namely the mechanistic materialist theory, over experience.
Is
And
it
yet
even a
science is
theory
supposed to
anymore?
be empirical, namely based on
Um,
experience. So it's a peculiar paradox.
Well, I mean, I don't even know if it qualifies as a theory any longer. It's attenuated to just a prejudice, because if you try to apply it as a theory, it doesn't yield much. I mean, yes, it's good that so much has been achieved by at times prescinding from other considerations other than what look like mechanistic chains of causation in medicine, for instance. Whatever one thinks, I mean, the recent vaccines. I really wouldn't necessarily want the people who've invented mRNA editing to be overly concerned about what metaphysical premises underlie the fairly functional instrumental investigations they might be undertaking. Now, if they were looking for deeper explanations in the philosophy classroom, then I would want them to. But uh, on the whole, I mean, I don't even know if this mechanistic view of reality even qualifies as a theory anymore. Uh, uh, it's simply become a kind of redoubt in which to hide from evidences that are inconvenient for the vision of reality you want to hold to. As for Sam Harris, though, he's a good example of the danger of looking at mechanism. You know, in the one of the great evil. Every age has its special evils, of course, but one of the great evils of late modern culture has been the technologization of nature and of humanity. You know, humanity treated as an economic technology, as a racial technology, as a political technology, as an anthropological technology. You know, and when you do that, of course, you're tempted to fix the machine in ways that you think will improve its functioning, rather than viewing the person as a kind of sacred temenos to be treated with reverence. And it doesn't surprise me that Sam Harris, is a completely credulous proponent of totally exploded racialist theory now. He supports Charles Murray's sort of racialist understanding of intelligence, and all of this is bad science, but it looks like good science to him because it corresponds to a fairly unforgiving mechanistic understanding of human evolution. That would it's the same thing. This goes back to the differences between Wallace and Darwin in a sense on the nature of so-called savages. And we should remember that the mechanistic paradigm carries with it some fairly horrific cultural sequelae if we see them as part of the intellectual environment that produced the horrors of the 20th century.
Yes. Well, dogs are a welcome relief from all that.
Yes.
And
Dogs aren't racists, and they don't build atomic bombs.
no,
So
and the utterly refreshing view that your book gives, it's not for everyone. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but it's for anyone who's interested in ideas and dogs and nature and God and
heroic a couple of
experience and and gardens and nature and the dawn and night and sleeplessness and indeed disease and health and death. It's a tremendously good read, and so I think perhaps we should draw to a close, and so that we have at least those who've followed us so far can have a rest. And I'd just like to say thank you very much, David. It was a real joy talking to you.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed this tremendously.
And let me just, for those who want to follow up on this great book, here it is again, Roland in Moonlight. And several of my friends are reading it at the moment, and also my son Merlin. And you have a growing number of people who really appreciate this extraordinary, unpredictable, and surprising book. Good.
I could listen to this all day.
Yes.
but I don't think it would be good for me. No, it was great. It's a great pleasure to talk to you. I've loved your work for many years, actually, going all the way back to being an undergraduate in England at the time, and reading A New Science of Life, and looking at the faces of the contorted faces of those who, in certain members of the scientific establishment, who just regarded it as heresy. I think what was the journal that said it was sort of the prime candidate for book burning that year?
Oh, Nature.
Nature, yes. That's not a wholesome thought. But,
Well, anyway, things are moving on, thank goodness, and I think that the animals are actually helping us do that, together with our sense that we have to change our relationship to the natural world.
well, yes, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, well, goodbye for now, David.
Take care. Thank
And
you.
I hope we'll meet again before too long.
I hope so, yes. Goodbye.
Bye.